Jason Todd's untimely death at the hands of the Joker is one of the great turning points in Batman's long and illustrious career. First happening in the now iconic Batman issue 428 in the Death in the Family storyline, Jason would fall into Joker's hands after being betrayed by none other than his own mother, after spending weeks hunting her down. He'd ultimately be beaten half to death with a crowbar, and then blown up in a warehouse as Batman showed up too late to save his second ward, proving that not even the Dark Knight could be in two places at once. The Arkham series, however, took a much different approach to Jason Todd in their take on the Batman universe. Jason wasn't so much as mentioned throughout any of the first three games in the series, outside of one tiny line of dialogue in a challenge map that hinted at his existence, but never outright said anything. But then he took a central role in the fourth mainline installment, Batman Arkham Knight. Today though, in the second episode of my new series, Arkham Elseworlds, we're going to be asking and subsequently answering the question, what if Batman found Jason Todd before his quote-unquote death? If this is the first episode you've seen, well, don't worry, it's only the second. But for a brief explanation, Arkham Elseworlds sees you guys send in your best Arkham what-if scenarios. I'll then pick the most intriguing entries and write a full Arkham universe story with them, taking into account the already established lore up until the point the story starts. In case you're wondering, I'd like to present these as comics one day, Elseworlds spin-off comics bridging or sometimes outright changing the events of the games we all know and love. The first episode saw us tackle the idea of Bane never losing his memories at the end of Arkham Origins, so go and check this out. Today though, we'll have some fun with the idea of Batman finding Jason in Arkham and rescuing him from the Joker before he completely turned him against the Dark Knight. So, without further ado, subscribe so we can hit 30,000 before the year's out, send in your best what-ifs down below for episode 3, and let's get into this, starting in Crime Alley. Crime Alley stood as a constant reminder to the city that crime never slept, and that was nowhere more evident than when one night while on patrol, Batman would park the Batmobile in the same alley his parents were gunned down. Weirdly though, that wasn't on his mind tonight. What mattered was bringing peace to the slums of the city. Upon returning from patrol, he'd hear metal clanking near the car. A trap from Joker? Had one of the criminals he put away found the car to tamper with it? Batman would cautiously approach the car and discover a young boy in a red hoodie desperately trying to unscrew the wheels from the newly built Batmobile. The child would try and run, but Batman would gently put his hand on his shoulder. The kid would look petrified and show Batman one of the two wheel nuts he'd managed to remove. Batman would ask how long they took to get off, and the child would tell the Dark Knight to let him go, and then pause and he'd say, about a couple of hours. We jump forward to the future, before Joker would normally take Arkham Asylum over. Batman was in full swing as an experienced, stoic symbol of justice, shaped by loss and above all else at this point, family. Dick Grayson had already flown the nest and become a hero of his own in Nightwing. However, Alfred was still there, Oracle was still there, but Bruce was alone for the first time in a while. Jason had been missing for 6 weeks. His suit's tracker was nowhere to be found, and no one, not Oracle, not Dick, and not even Alfred had heard from him. He was seemingly gone without a trace. Fears had started to mount among the Bat family that the Joker had Jason. Jason had gone after the Clown Prince of Crime following Joker breaking into a kindergarten and ending the lives of the entire class, where, upon completing the first part of his sick plan, he would dismember the children and sew them back together to be sent to the police. Jason threw his suit tracker away, knowing Batman would stop him from going after the Joker, and if it were there, and it was there, he went missing. The safe bet was that Jason went after Joker and got caught, but this was Joker after all, who knows what happened. The Joker hadn't been seen either, further adding to the worry that filled the cave. Weeks would pass and there'd still be no information on Jason. Batman had been growing more and more violent, beating Scarecrow into submission, taking Mr. Freeze out with extreme force, and most disturbingly, operating on the edge of torture while questioning Harley Quinn on Joker's whereabouts. But despite saying she'd never rat on her pudding, even if she had a good reason to, which she didn't know where he was. Something that unnerved Bruce, because if he had Jason, that would be the worst case scenario. And if Quinn didn't know where he was, then he was definitely off the grid. Bruce was spiralling and there was no end in sight. Dick would check in every now and then, but he'd be all but stonewalled by Bruce. Not out of hatred, but out of Bruce shutting himself in, dedicating every waking hour to finding any amount of information about Jason, but ultimately coming up short every time. One night, he'd look over to where Jason's suit used to hang while not on patrol. Bruce would get up and walk over to it, and Alfred would ask him what he was doing. Bruce would simply tell him that he was thinking. Alfred would say that that's all he's been doing lately. Thinking, fighting, searching. He's scared about the possibility of Master Todd being missing, or worse, in the Joker's sick clutches, but cutting him off, cutting Oracle off, and cutting Nightwing off, well, that won't help anybody. Bruce just scowls into his own reflection, and we cut to Batman out on patrol later that week, stopping crimes, robberies, muggings, potential murders. He'd even take down a couple of minor named villains like Black Spider and the Clue Master. It's when he'd be alerted to a robbery going down at a local car dealership that things would take a turn. An operator at the GCPD would say they'd had reports of some goons breaking into the old Gotham car dealership. On the way to the dealership, we'd flash back to Jason's first day on patrol. He'd be jumping around the cave, telling Bruce and Alfred to get ready because they were about to meet the new boy wonder. Jason would jump on top of the Batmobile and flips off it, introducing himself as Robin, Gotham's newest hero. Bruce smiles and tells Jason he needs to save his energy for his first night out on patrol. Jason tells him to get in the car and stop stalling. He says bye to Alfred and jumps in the passenger seat of the Batmobile. Alfred puts his hand on Bruce's shoulder and tells him Master Todd reminds him of Dick on his first night out, although somehow more excited. We'd cut back to Bruce in the car. He'd look over at the passenger seat as the memory of Jason faded away, and he'd speed off to the dealership. Upon arriving, Batman would jump out of the car, enter the dealership, and find a group of cars without their wheels. He wouldn't see any robbers though, but they'd see him. One of them, a short girl in makeup, jumps on Batman's back while two men rush him from the front. Batman throws the girl at the men as one more comes out with a revolver. He manages to get the jump on Batman and holds him at gunpoint, almost de-escalating the situation. The man, now behind Batman, introduces himself. He says his name is Johnny Frost, and he continues saying that if Batman ever touches his girl again, he'll drop him quicker than a bad punchline. The two men in front of Batman both look at one another, almost worried. The man on the left asks the man on the right if he should do the evil monologue, or if the other guy wouldn't mind doing it. Batman stands there unfazed by the gun pressed to the back of his head and asks them who they are. Batman lunges at the man, quickly breaking the line of sight with the other thugs by throwing a smoke bomb down. He knocks him out, throws a batarang at Frost, and delivers a quick combo to Punchline and Gaggy, rendering them useless. Batman would then grapple out of the window to a nearby building. This was it, he was going to get some answers. Whether he had to cross lines was more a question of when rather than if. Jason was out there, alone, scared, and he had to get answers. These might have just been low-level thugs, but looks could be deceiving, especially in Gotham, and especially with names like Punchline and Gaggy. Batman wakes Johnny Frost up, hanging him over the edge of a building. He'd calmly tell him to start talking, and stands silently after that. Frost manages to get his bearings, and he tells Batman he can't say anything. Batman ensures that if he doesn't start talking, he won't be saying anything ever again. Frost stumbles over his words and he tells Batman that he's lost it, and he tells him that he didn't know what he was trying to get out of him. Batman would drag Frost up onto the roof and stand on his chest, screaming at him to tell him where Jason was, where his son was. Frost splutters out a scared sentence. He tells him he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He doesn't know what the hell he's done apart from taking a few rims from a few nice cars. Batman leaves go of Frost, who manages to scuttle away to the other side of the roof. He reaches for a gun, but Batman just stands there, almost defeated. He'd been at this now for weeks with no rest. Frost screams at him, telling him he's out of his goddamn mind. He reaches in his other pocket and launches a small chunk of metal at Batman, almost comically enraged at the Dark Knight. The metal hits Batman and bounces off of his suit and falls to the ground, before the pair are interrupted by Gaggy, Punchline and Bob. Batman doesn't immediately check the thrown object, instead just standing, stoic, quiet and unmoving. Again, he'd been at this for weeks. Jason was missing, he was exhausted, he was done. Mentally, physically, he was just done, but he couldn't give up, not on himself, and especially not on Jason. Not now. The four thugs now stood across from Batman, all injured. They'd run, and Batman would let them. He looked down at the metal on the floor one more time, and he leaned down, pick it up, but it felt familiar, almost unique. It had a bat etched on it. It was a wheel nut from the Batmobile. It would click, and there'd be a moment of realisation where Batman would snap. He'd lunge at the four criminals, brutally taking them down, before screaming at them with everything he had, telling them that he knew they knew something about Robin. Where else could they have gotten this from? This was one of the wheel nuts off of the Batmobile, identical to the one Jason gave him on that night he found him, the one he keeps in his belt as a constant reminder of Jason. He'd continue saying that he made a solemn promise, one line he'd never cross, but tonight, he'd cross that line if they pushed him. Batman would tie the thugs up and begin his interrogation. He'd start with the girl. He'd begin to punch a hole next to the wall next to her. As he cocked his arm back though, Frost would scream in fear. He'd break down as the other two guys told him to shut up. Johnny would say he can't take it anymore, and he'd tell Batman one thing. Jay had taken the bird to a prison of his own design. Batman would stand up, he'd turn around and walk away, leaving the criminals tied up against a wall for the GCPD. They'd scream at him, asking him if he wanted to know where Robin was, but Batman would turn around and tell them he already knew, before jumping from the building. He'd land in the car and tell Alfred he knew where Jason was. He had to be in Arkham Asylum, somewhere. Alfred would react in pure disbelief. He'd ask Bruce if he wanted to call Master Dick in. He doesn't know what he's going to find in there, but Bruce says he can't drag anyone else into his mess now. This was on him. This was his burden. Bruce would drive to Arkham, reliving his days working with Jason. He'd relive them taking down Harvey Dent, Riddler, Penguin, all of the rogues Batman had ever faced. Jason was strong, but if Joker had him, it didn't matter. He was just a boy after all. A boy he'd put in the firing line, and a boy who was now locked inside a prison he'd been feeding the criminals that it needed to keep running without failure, without a chance in hell of anyone taking time to search it properly. Batman would know he had no other choice than to lock criminals up, but if they weren't there, if they weren't dragging him left and right, maybe he'd have checked, maybe he'd have searched in the one place on Earth Joker feels at home. But he didn't. This was on his watch. But tonight, he was going to get Jason Todd back. He'd arrive at Arkham and it was quiet, almost too quiet. He'd enter intensive treatment, but it was empty and he'd find nothing. Arkham was a ghost town. That illusion of peace would quickly be broken as a guard would appear and greet Batman. Batman asked the guard to take him to the security office now. The guard would comply and take Batman to the office in the building. Here, accompanied by the guard, Batman would hack into the system and try to find some kind of bird's eye view layout of the asylum, but all of the files had been erased from the system. The guard would tell Batman he'd leave him to it, and then he'd leave the room. The door would shut, and then subsequently open again. Batman would hear some heavy footsteps behind him, and knowing this wasn't good, he'd turn around and see Officer Frank Bowles mid-swing of a baseball bat. Batman would duck it and snap the bat, calmly telling Bowles that he knew he was bent before he took a swing at him, but he didn't know he was stupid. Before asking Bowles to see the blueprints of the building now. Frank would kind of sneer and tell Batman that they were gone, he'd deleted them. Batman would grab Bowles by his collar and tell him if he knew why he was here, it'd be in his best interest to listen and do as he said. He'd tell Bowles to take him to the blueprints, the floor plan, anything that meant he could have a bird's eye view of the asylum. An original bird's eye view of the asylum. Bowles would reply telling the Dark Knight that he knew why he was here, he knew someone would rat sooner rather than later. He'd throw himself at a button on the desk behind him and open every single cell in the intensive treatment. Batman would yell at Bowles. He'd say he'd made this harder than it needed to be before knocking him out and throwing him aside. He'd stand for a second, hearing the cells clanking open and hearing the warning blaring over the tannoy. Warden Sharp's office. If he was going to find any remnants of the original blueprints, they'd be in there. But half of Gotham's criminals stood between him and the mansion. But nothing was going to stand between him and Jason. He'd map out a mental route to the mansion. Out of the roof of intensive treatment, turn right, through the tunnel past the gardens, and right through Warden Sharp's window. Easy. He'd open the door and begin fighting his way through the thugs, the criminals, the murderers, the thieves, the gangs. They'd all see this as an easy chance to take some blood from the Bat, and most of them would get their wish. Batman was good, but he wasn't invincible. Victor Zsasz would even dive on him at one point, stabbing him over and over and over again with a shard of glass. The Dark Knight would scream in pain and throw Zsasz into a wall before putting him out of commission for the night. Batman would just about make it to the door out of intensive treatment, his suit bloodied and cut. Just as the door opened, a foul smell would fill the air. Fishy and gross. Killer Croc. Batman would turn around and he'd tell Wayland to stand down. He wasn't here to fight him, he just wanted to find Robin, that's all. He'd been breathing heavily, he was reaching the end of his tether, he'd been searching for weeks, he hadn't slept in over a week. He couldn't fight Croc, his belt was all but empty. Croc would sniff the air and say he smelt death on Batman, and he'd make him into a good meal. A better meal than what he gets fed here. Batman would back towards the door and open it, and Croc would begin lurching towards him. Batman would turn around and grapnel up to the nearest guard tower outside, expecting to be safe from Croc, but his mutation had made him strong. Strong enough to rip the tower from the floor and knock it down. Batman would transition into a glide on his way down, and he'd manage to reach the tunnel with Croc hot on his trail. Telling him that he was going to kill him and that he couldn't run forever. Batman would manage to make it through the tunnel while Croc destroyed everything behind him, and he would finally see the mansion. He was so close. Jason was so close. Batman would grapnel up again, trying to create distance between him and the former circus freak. But Croc would cut him off mid-grapnel, tackling him towards the mansion. He'd tell Batman it was over, but Batman would just say it wasn't, it hadn't even begun, before he'd smirk through the pain, revealing to Croc he'd sprayed his back with explosive gel, his last canister. Boom, Batman blows it up and takes Croc down. He'd leave Croc laying in the courtyard outside the manor before grappling up to the roof and breaking in through a window right into the Warden's wing. The Warden would damn near fall out of his chair as Batman would kick in his door in and demand the blueprints to the manor. Sharp would very quickly get out of his chair and ask Batman about the breakout happening in intensive treatment. He'd tell him that his guard can take care of it now, the ones who aren't on Joker's payroll anyway. Sharp would ask Batman what he meant, but Batman would cut him off and ask for the blueprints now. Quincy, as fast as he could physically move, would search through his drawers, finding a file which contained Cyrus Pinckney III's original sketches of the Asylum's floor plan. Batman would skip through them, the intensive treatment, the medical centre, the penitentiary, the visitors centre, the mansion, the sewers. He'd scan them all and send them to Alfred and tell him to run them against the publicly available records. He'd run the blueprints against the ones held in Gotham's public library, and the Bat computer would basically do all of the work, finding only one difference: a room in the basement of the mansion. Alfred would tell Bruce that the only difference was right below his feet, that had to be where Jason was being hidden. It had to be. Anywhere else and someone would have heard him or found him or said something. Batman would turn to Sharp and tell him he'd be back for him later. Sharp would awkwardly and quite frantically ask what for, but Batman would tell him that if he finds what he thinks he'll find down there, he'll have been complicit in this whole thing, and he intends to find out why after he's done here. Breaking character here, this could set up a plot thread going into Arkham City, or even a reworked Arkham Asylum. After all, we've already just had the big prison breakout and everything happening there, so, you know, this could lead into some cool stuff, further showing just how corrupt Sharp had become, being brainwashed and threatened into allowing Joker to hide Batman's partner right under his nose. Honestly, Sharp could also, you know, not know about this, but like, the point of this series is to do some kind of cool and weird stuff, and I think that's kind of cool, and really highlights just how utterly corrupt and irredeemable Sharp became following his psychotic overhaul at the hands of Hugo Strange and Jervis Tetch. Anyway, back to the story. Batman would begin making his way through the halls of the manor, a place he'd never really been. There were no cells here, no reason for Batman to be here, just a long, miserable history of death and sadness. It had once been the Founder's home, and now had become something much more twisted, and if Jason was down there in the room that had been stricken off the records at some point, he'd be just another footnote in a long history of this misery. Batman would open the door to the basement and look down the stairs. He'd begin the descent, and each footstep would make him feel heavier, slower. The blood loss was making him stumble, but he knew Jason was down there somewhere. Bruce would reach the bottom of the basement, but there'd be nothing. No indicator of a room. He'd turn his crime scene cowl analysis on, but again, nothing. Bruce would just look. He'd look around, he'd look at the walls, blood dripping from his suit. Alfred would radio through to him, and he'd tell him the room was on the left. Bruce would tell him that he knew that, but he was scared. That fear of failure he hadn't felt since the night his parents died, the night he couldn't protect them. He knew somehow Jason had to be behind that wall, but what if Joker had actually done it? What would stop him from finding him and killing him? Alfred tells him he needs to stop doubting himself and get through that damn wall now. Bruce would look for a way in on the wall, a secret button, a misplaced brick. Just nothing would show up though. He'd have to do this the old-fashioned way. He'd strike the wall knowing that he'd just used his last explosive gel canister on Croc. The bricks would begin crumbling in on themselves. They'd just crumble, they wouldn't even break, they'd just turn into sand. Hinges would appear. There was a door after all. He missed it. He was losing his edge. He'd grab the hole he'd made and yank, pulling the brick-laden door open. Bruce would make out a boy strapped to a chair with barbed wire hunched over. The boy would spring to life and scream. Pure, unbridled fear would fill the air. It was Jason, but he was broken. The physical scars were clear, but the mental ones could go deeper than anyone could have imagined. Bruce would rip his cowl off, and Jason, cowering away, trying to turn away from his father, would still be screaming. Batman would grab a batarang and cut the barbed wire away, but initially Jason wouldn't move. He'd flinch, but no more than that. The idea of freedom had seemed so distant to him that he simply just sat there. He would say nothing. Bruce would try to check on him, but Jason would attack him. Weakly though, he'd act like a child. No finesse, no brutality. Bruce would put his arms up to defend himself, but it really didn't take much. Eventually, after the flurry of abuse, he'd break down and begin crying on his knees. Bruce would get on his knees in front of him and hold him close. He'd tell Jason he was safe now, that he was going to be okay. Jason would pass out, leaving Bruce cradling his now limp body in his arms, and we'd cut away to another flashback, this time after a particularly strenuous mission where the duo had to stop Mr. Freeze from stealing a precious gem from a museum under the illusion it would be the key to save his wife. The duo would crash through the skylight in the museum and leap into action, with Batman laying the final punch on Freeze to lay him out cold. Jason would be tired. He'd really been thrown into the deep end, and when the GCPD arrived at the scene, the pair would take their leave, and upon driving back to the cave, Jason would fall asleep, having not slept in 3 days. When the dynamic duo got back to the Batcave, Todd was still out, and while Bruce did consider waking him up to get him out of the car, he instead left him to rest, picking him up in his arms and taking him to his room, laying him down in his bed, his Robin suit still on. We fade back into Arkham to the current day, Batman cradling the beaten Jason Todd in his arms while walking towards the Batmobile. He'd lay him down in the passenger seat of the car and tell Alfred to get the medical bay ready. He was bringing Jason home. Alfred would breathe a sigh of relief, in awe that Bruce had actually found Master Todd. He'd tell Bruce to hurry home and we'd cut to the drive home. Bruce would keep looking over at Jason, the second boy wonder mumbling in his sleep. Too quiet for Bruce to hear over the sound of the car's engine. Whatever he was saying, it can't have been anything good, probably reliving the nightmares of whatever Joker and his goons had done to him. The Batmobile would be lowered into the cave and Bruce would jump out, being met by Alfred. He'd pick Jason up out of the car and carry him over to the medical bay. Alfred would be in suspended shock. He couldn't quite believe Jason was alive. He couldn't believe the state he was in either, so he began his checks immediately. He'd spend hours physically checking over Jason. He'd been through hell. He'd been scarred all over. Wounds consistent with being hit with a blunt object. Shot, stabbed, and most disturbingly, branded. Alfred would find a J branded on Jason's chest, a disturbing reminder of the torture he'd been through. Alfred would leave Jason to rest, putting him on an IV drip. He'd then head to the bed next to Jason and tend to Bruce. He'd been through worse. This was bad, but he'd recover. He was too stubborn to die. 2 days later, Jason would come back to life, so to speak, reborn under the lights of the Batcave. He'd spring up, but hurt himself as his abdomen crunched under his own strain. Jason would begin looking around, worried and scared. Bruce, who'd been stood at his bedside, would walk over to him and tell him to rest. He's been through a lot. Jason would look confused and he'd say Bruce's name in a questioning manner, like he couldn't believe he was there. Bruce would tell him he'd brought him home and that he was safe now. Jason would begin tearing up, reliving the trauma he'd endured in his mind. Physically, he'd recover, he'd endure. He was a strong guy. But mentally, it would take more than bandages and an IV drip to repair what had been broken inside his head. Bruce would tell him he didn't need to worry anymore, that he was back home. Jason would wipe his tears away and manage to tell Bruce that he needed to go out and find the Joker, and then he'd mutter that he needed to kill him. Bruce would tell Jason that he knows he won't do that. Jason just lays back down and tells Bruce he knows he won't do that, but it was worth saying. He just wants revenge. Bruce replies and tells Jason that revenge was something they could do, this time anyway. He tells Jason he'd put the idea of revenge behind him a long time ago, but this was something he couldn't and wouldn't let go. He'd find Joker and make him pay, but not yet. His first priority was seeing Jason back to health. Alfred would interrupt them and say they had a visitor or two. Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon would come down the stairs and Jason would turn to look at them. Dick would run over to Jason and hug him. Jason would grunt in pain and Dick says that he's sorry, but he's just happy he's back. Barbara gives him a more gentle hug and says she's so happy to see him safe. There'd be an awkward silence, no one really knowing what to say to Jason or each other. He'd been through hell and back, but no one really knew where they went from here. Alfred, Bruce, Dick, and Barbara would agree to let Jason get some more rest and let him sleep a bit longer. They head upstairs and talk about how Bruce found him and whatnot, then Dick would bring up the Joker. Bruce would tell him to keep his damn voice down, but it was too late. Jason stumbled up the stairs and shouted at Dick, telling him to carry on, don't let him stop the conversation. Dick tries to apologise, but Jason lashes out. He tells him to keep that man's name out of his mouth, at least until he's dead. Bruce tries to step in between them, but Dick says he's happy to see Jason hasn't lost his personality, and Jason actually tries to attack Dick, but Bruce catches him in midair and tells him to take it easy. He's still weak, he's still recovering from being on the brink of death. Jason again breaks down and he starts trying to finally tell Bruce and the others what happened to him in the asylum, but he just can't get the words out, and he's told to get some more rest, and Bruce takes him back to the medical centre. We'd cut to 6 weeks later. Batman and Nightwing had spent the time between Jason being found and now hunting for anything relating to the Joker, but Jason had been growing tired of resting. He felt like he could be out there helping, but Batman, nay Bruce, had implored him to stay at home and rest. They don't know just how deep Joker got into his mind, but Jason says he feels fine, but clearly he doesn't. Alfred had been tending to Jason's every need, worried for his mental state. He'd been angry, angrier than he ever was. He'd take up his training again, and he'd been training harder than ever. It was almost ritualistic. Every day he'd be there in the cave fighting training simulations, but also his own demons implanted by the Clown Prince of Crime. Alfred had been telling Bruce Jason was more aggressive and more resentful of the notion that he can't exact revenge on Joker, but the family had been doing everything to keep him in line. He'd even grow jealous of Dick, seeing his return to Gotham as an event which would overshadow his own return from hell and from the clutches of death. Obviously this wasn't the case, but Jason was sure Dick was the golden child. He was sure he was being replaced by Dick right in front of his eyes. Dick had left for Bloodhaven before Bruce and him ever met, but every night it was, "No Jason, stay here, we'll find Joker." But they didn't know the Joker, and he did. Jason would try and tell them everything he knew, everything he remembers from his time in that basement, in captivity, in the dark, cold, rat-infested basement, but it felt like he was being dismissed. Bruce's own stubbornness had convinced himself he still knew the Joker the best, better than even Jason. But Jason had been there. He'd been in the mind of the Joker. He'd had a sick part of that mind implanted into his own head. Joker had started trying to convince Jason that Batman was to blame for him being captured. He'd drill it into his brain that Batman's crusade would only end up with those closest to him dying, including Jason. He'd tricked Jason into believing he'd already been replaced by a third boy wonder mere weeks after being captured by using doctored images. Joker had even distanced himself from Harley, saying he wanted to be a better father to Jason than Batman ever was, pouring all of his love and attention into the boy wonder in his own sick way. It all threw Jason's belief in Batman into a whirlpool of doubt, but as much as Jason believed he was recovering, that niggling feeling in the back of his mind that maybe, just maybe, Joker cared more about him than Bruce ever did was still there. After weeks of searching, interrogating every single villain they could get their hands on, no one knew anything about the Joker. He had gone underground, whether out of fear for what Batman would do to him should they find him, or maybe he's out there plotting some twisted scheme to one-up even this. Batman and Nightwing would get back to the cave one night after patrol, and they go tell Jason what they found that night, but Jason interrupts them and makes a comment about how they still couldn't punch their way to the Joker, could they? Bruce says they're trying, they want to get their hands on the Joker as badly as Jason does, but it wasn't something they could force. Jason sits in silence for a minute and he tells Bruce if the roles were reversed, he'd have done everything in his power to find the monster who broke him. He'd find whoever did this and he'd make them suffer. But maybe Bruce just didn't care. He'd brought Jason home and he's grateful for that, but Bruce interrupts and he tells Jason he's trying, he's pulling all the strings he can, and he tells Jason he loves him and that him and Dick are truly trying everything they can. Jason wallows in the silence for a minute before simply replying, "No, you haven't done all you can, Bruce, but he would have." We'd see the Batcave sit in pure, unfiltered silence. Jason sat, breaking down into a state of internal anger, Dick and Bruce standing in front of him, finally seeing the true extent of the mental effects Joker had left on him. And that's how I write my story of Batman finding Jason Todd before Joker quote-unquote killed him. I know this is a subject people really like. Jason Todd is a fan favourite, ironically enough, considering the circumstances of how he died in the first place, but I hope you enjoyed this. This was a really fun one to write. I wanted to kind of try and tackle the aftermath of Jason being found, because obviously it's not something we've really ever seen apart from, like, Batman Arkham Knight. So I thought it would be like an interesting thing to kind of see the effects Joker had on Jason, unfiltered, like, not Lazarus Pit infected. Like, this is just Jason. This is what he believes. This is what, in his still young mind, we have to remember Jason's only 16, 17 years old here, that, like, the Joker has really infected his mind. And yeah, I think that's such a cool premise. And this is going to sound really stupid, but this is true. Right hand to God, this is true. The ending for this story came to me in a dream. I know, it sounds weird. It wasn't exactly these characters in this situation. But yeah, that final line, actually, like, I had a dream about, like, 6 months ago. And that was, like, the one thing I remember from it. That line, that, but he would have. And I thought that was, like, so haunting if it was done in the right way. So yeah, I really wanted to include that here. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your favourite what-ifs down below. This is a series I'm really enjoying at the moment. I'm really enjoying writing Batman stories. I know I've done it before in the rewrites and Arkham Reckoning, which I did a couple of weeks ago. But, like, yeah, writing Batman stories at the moment I'm just having so much fun with. And it's giving me an excuse to really brush up on some of the comics I missed as well, which is nice. To try and sort of further my writing, I guess. I know these are, like, quite short form stories, but still, I think they're quite fun. But yeah, let me know your favourite what-if scenarios down below. Leave a like, subscribe so we can hit 30,000 by the end of the year, and I'll see you later. Stay safe out there, and don't get kidnapped and put into Arkham Asylum's basement. Goodbye.